Tom, one of the things that you said in your presentation downstairs was that the problems that we face now with regard to climate change and sustainability are really soft problems as opposed to hard problems. What do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean is that to a large extent the technology we need to get out of the carbon problem, i.e. Produce clean green energy and power our civilization, they've largely been invented. There are a couple of gaps. We need better storage solutions and so on, but enhanced geothermal, large-scale solar thermal, high-voltage DC lines bringing wind power from one side of the continent to another, these are already invented. What we really need to deploy them at an incredibly large scale. So the problem is, how do we generate that scale? We've invented it, we need to deploy it. So the scale is enormous. I mean, it's trillions and trillions of dollars. So we have a financial issue. Where do we get that capital from? How do we motivate that capital into the sector? And we also have the problem of sort of getting the government to kickstart that movement, because it's not going to happen by itself. And we also, so we have the financial sector, we have the political will, and we also, of course, need the public behind this this is the biggest infrastructure rebuild in human history. And we really need to have the public deeply engaged on this to allow it to happen, essentially. They have to support it. So that's what I mean by soft problems. They're people problems, people, politics, changing behavior, changing ways of thinking, as opposed to hard problems like we haven't invented, geothermal power yet or something.
Right,
we have. And innovation will continue to play a role. But we need to deploy what we've got. And that's what I mean by the problems being soft rather than hard.
One of the things, those soft problems can actually be quite difficult problems sometimes as well. And one of the things that gets thrown up constantly is, well, of course we all want to be sustainable, but it's so terribly expensive. And you talk a lot about the need to access low-cost capital. So what is the role for private enterprise and the state to work together in freeing up that low-cost capital?
Well, that's the question.
Okay.
And certainly by soft, I don't mean easy. Soft is much more difficult and much more complicated. So I think the role, between the private sector and public sector is to figure out a way to leverage the capacity of the private sector to deliver innovative solutions, to leverage their capital, to leverage their expertise. I mean, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm a venture capitalist. I'm fully aware of the kind of resources that the business community can bring to bear. However, they are enormously conservative, especially when it comes to large amounts of capital.
Yeah.
Managers who sit on pension funds, I mean, they have a job, and their job is to be conservative and make sure that money's there tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after, and the day after. And typically a manager doesn't get fired for doing today what they did yesterday. They didn't get fired yesterday. So we need to sort of incent the private sector who sits on these large amounts of capital to motivate them to be a part of the solution. And so one way that I've suggested that we do that, and the World Bank has sort of gotten on board, is called a green bond. So a green bond is really just a way of having the government lend its risk rate, so the government backstops the bond, but the money is deployed by the private sector. So the bond is used to raise capital from pension funds and the general public and so on. In my view, it should be managed by the private sector, how those funds get dispersed. Again, the private sector will make the right decisions if given from the government the right mandate. So the government simply sort of lends its risk rate, backstops those bonds, and essentially just acts to redirect savings into a sector that we know can benefit from that low-cost debt. There's lots of details, right? How we mitigate the risk and how we mitigate loan defaults and cost to government. That can all be done, and there are mechanisms to do that. But fundamentally, it's the government stepping in and saying, I'm going to backstop the risk to make sure that the interest rate is very low, and then I will give you a mandate, reduce carbon at a low cost to me, the government, and you will get your annual fees based on the success of those metrics. But you decide where the money goes.
Right.
It's technology neutral. You figure out how to best do it. I'm going to lend my risk rate to make sure the debt's low cost.
Do you get the sense that there's any pickup in government for this idea?
Absolutely. I mean, in Europe, the European Central Bank has issued green bonds in 3 rounds. The World Bank issued the last round in Swedish kroner and explicitly said, we think this should be a central fiscal tool of national governments around the world. So some heavyweights are behind it. Each country has its own way of doing it. I think Canada has a Made in Canada solution, which you can find at greenbonds.ca if you'd like to know what I think about our Made in Canada solution would look like. But the United States has issued, I think they're talking about a $2 billion green bond issue to fund a green bank. So some heavyweights are behind this. I think what we need to do in Canada is figure out what our solution is going to be, in particular to our economic environment. There is interest in some provincial governments, but I have to be honest, there's no uptake at the federal level on this issue right now.
Okay. Now, one of the other things that comes out of the report, you've just written and published a book called Kick the Fossil Fuel Habit. In the report that Siemens commissioned, one of the things that comes out is that most of the people involved in infrastructure think there should be much greater investment in green technology, but if they're betting on where the future is headed, they think the focus is still going to be on fossil fuels. What do you think when you hear that kind of prediction?
I think I unfortunately think it's a realistic prediction. I mean, to many people, the problems of climate change that is brought about by carbon is still a future abstract problem, whereas our energy needs are pressing today. And that's a classic problem, right? The long-term pain and short-term gain. And I think so it's easy for people to say, for example, natural gas is seen as a transition fuel. So the danger in looking at natural gas as a transition fuel, and I agree with the premise, it is. It's half the carbon per unit of energy than coal. The problem is that if we, it's like putting 5% ethanol in the fuel at the tank. You think you've done your bit and you're done now.
Right.
Infrastructure that we build lasts for 50 years. If we're going to build significant natural gas infrastructure to replace, coal, that's okay, but it's only an interim step, and we need to be aware that it's an interim step. But to be fair, the people who run the grid, their job is to keep the lights on. And part of what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to have a discussion that says we can keep the lights on long term and keep the factories humming with 100% commitment to renewable energy, enhanced geothermal and all the rest of it. There's ways of doing that, and I think if we begin that discussion, we won't go too far down the path of relying on fossil fuel to solve our immediate problems, natural gas being the least of the worst,
right.
And we might be able to leapfrog that. So when Africa got phone systems, they didn't install landlines and then get cell phones.
Right.
They went from no phones to cell phones. And that's what I'm advocating. And natural gas can certainly fill a gap if we need it, but we can think past that now.
Excellent. Thank you very much for your time, Tom.
You're more than welcome.